Lord Mannion threw his dress cloak over his black cloak of office, locking the clasps, held at the throat, a gold chain braided like rope. Turning back to regard the front hall once more, satisfied that everything was in order, he extinguished the lamp, closed the door, and locked it with a large bronze key. Mannion's dwelling was similar to the other houses owned by the officials of Mereklar, a large rectangular building with white stone, with panes of glass in every wall. It had, however, a run-down look. The Minister of Internal Affairs was not a wealthy man. Some said he squandered his money on women and in the taverns. He didn't own his own carriage, but Lord Brunswick's estate was close enough for him to walk to. Lord Mannion set off down the street toward the middle of the city. The way led him through part of the town, then into a park. As he walked, he peered up into the sky to observe the stars and moons, smiling at the nearly full circles of the solitary lunetary. Soon, he thought, very soon. Mannion's heavy black boots clicked along the white stone sidewalks. The night was silent. The city's inhabitants had shut themselves in, barring their doors against a vague and unknown terror. The Lord was smiling, shaking his head at their folly when, turning a corner, he suddenly heard a throaty growl. Mannion looked back up the street. The sidewalk was brightly lit by the magical lights. He saw nothing and continued on his way, peering back over his shoulder from time to time. Lord Mannion heard the growl again, closer, and now a soft padding of footsteps. Instead of turning around and stopping to see what it was, the Lord increased his pace. His boots sounded loudly on the pavement until he reached a park. He breathed easier. The soft ground muffled his steps. The tall trees hid his form. He couldn't hear his pursuer anymore. And then it was there again, following him, undeterred by darkness. The growl sounded closer and more menacing. The Lord began to sweat, drawing his breath in shallow, short gasps. Ducking behind a tree, pressing his back into the hard bark, he pulled a dagger from a sheath. A long jeweled blade curved near the narrow tip, and held it point down in his hand. He waited, as still as the night, for as many heartbeats as he dared, listening intently, extending his sense of sight and hearing as far as it would go. He heard nothing, saw nothing. Lord Mannion breathed a small sigh of relief. An arm slammed his head back against a tree. A hand grabbed his dagger and threw it into the nearby hedge, disabling and disarming the man in one efficient action. "How did you get here?" the attacker whispered. He was dressed in black, a shadow against shadows. Mannion stared into the eyes of his assailant, eyes that were red in the lambent light of the moons. The Lord spit with loathing and hatred. "Answer me," the man in black hissed, driving his arm farther into the minister's throat. The Lord lifted a leg and kicked his attacker in the stomach, sending the assailant flying backward. Mannion leaped at the man he had just thrown, landing on top of him and grasping for his throat. The man in black brought his right arm across in a horizontal arc, sweeping his hand against Mannion's chest. Claws ripped open a great gash of black against a white silk shirt. The Lord screamed in agony. The attacker drove his other hand into the minister's throat. lifting him off the ground, sending him sprawling. Mannion, shaking his head to clear it, renewed the battle in a frenzy, fighting with his bare hands. The claws slashed again, tearing flesh. The lord fell to his knees. The assailant brought his right leg up in a kick that snapped Mannion's head backward, causing him to land with his arms and legs spread out, completely vulnerable. Bending over the minister, the man in black reached down with an arm, attempting to drag the lord to his feet. Mannion slammed his head into the attacker's chest. Grabbing the dark-clothed limbs, he rushed forward, dashing the man full force into a tree. Air whooshed from the attacker's lungs, and he fell to his knees and hands, as a minister had done moments before. Mannion lifted the man up by the collar and struck him in the face, causing his head to rebound back against the wood. The assailant ducked the next blow sluggishly, though just quickly enough. The lord's fist slammed against a tree, cracking the bark. Throwing rough chips into the air, Mannion, still holding on to the attacker, with his other hand, threw him to the ground and kicked him with such force that the front of his boot ripped off. The other man collapsed, and the lord stood over him. A look of cruelty and hatred twisted his features. He lifted his leg, preparing to smash his foot down directly on the man's head. The slight hesitation was all the attacker needed. He grabbed Mannion's leg, wrenched it around, breaking it at the hip. Mannion collapsed in a terrible cry. The attacker stood, lifting the Minister of Affairs off the ground by the throat with one arm. He snarled, exposing unusually long and pointed teeth. "What are you doing here?" he asked again. "You will be destroyed, as will all your kind," Mannion cried hoarsely. "Will we?" questioned the man in black. He jerked the lord's head back. The neck snapped. The minister went limp, though for a moment his eyes appeared remarkably alive, remarkably malevolent. Tossing Mannion to the ground, the assassin bent down over the corpse. Sharp claws rent cloak and clothes, skin and sinew. "You will have whatever you need, Raistlin," Shabas said. The discussions had been concluded. Lord Cal had not returned, and Caramon was wondering if Shabas had sent him out on some sort of trumped-up mission in order to get rid of him. "Thank you, Counselor, and officials of Mereklar," Raistlin said with a slight sneer. "When will you start?" Lady Massac asked. "I have already started, Lady Massac." The mage smiled. The women appeared somewhat alarmed. Everyone began to make preparations to leave, gathering up any notes that they had taken during the talk, when the door flew open. Lord Cal stepped in. "Counselors, I must speak with you." The man's voice was strained, tense. Going to Shabas, he whispered something. Color drained from the woman's face. She swallowed, opened her mouth, closed it. "Gentlemen," Lord Cal glared at Raistlin and his companions, "I must speak with the ministers in private. Will you excuse us, please?" It wasn't a request, but a command. Raistlin, Caramon left the room, Caramon returning in a moment to grab the candor. "I didn't know what he meant. I didn't know he meant me," Earwig said, wriggling in the warrior's grasp. "No one ever called me a gentleman before." The door shut behind them. Raistlin waited until he heard the lock click. Then he swiftly withdrew one of the pouches hanging from his belt. Removing the cup he used to mix his drink, he placed it against one of the walls and put his ear to it, listening intently. There came a scraping sound from inside, and Raisin sprang backward, thrusting the cup beneath the folds of his robe. The door opened and Chavas entered the hall. "I'm sorry, but we must end the meeting now. My carriage will take you back to your lodgings." She gazed at them as if she wanted to say something, but couldn't make up her mind. Then, shaking her head, she dispatched a servant, turned and re-entered the council room, closing the door behind her. "What did you hear?" Caramon came over to Raisin, who was leaning on his staff, staring after the women thoughtfully. "Lord Mannion, he's been killed. His body was found in a park not far from here." Caramon stared. "Killed?" "Excuse me, sirs." The coachman entered. "Councillor Chavas has instructed me to take you to your inn." "Maybe we're not ready to go," Caramon began. Raisin laid a hand on his arm. "I'm feeling tired. I could use a night's rest." He took a step forward and then suddenly halted, glancing around. "My staff! I left it behind in the council room." "No, you didn't," said Caramon. "You had it just a moment." The warrior stared. The staff was nowhere to be seen. "I don't want to interrupt the meeting. If you could wait for us, sir," said Raisin to the coachman. "We'll be right out. You can wait outside," he added pointedly. The driver appeared dubious, but not having any instructions to the contrary, he left the room. Raisin breathed a sigh of relief. "Good. Now, Caramon, we must leave this house without anyone noticing us. There must be another door. Ah, yes. We'll use this one." "Where are you going?" "To the park, to inspect the body ourselves." "Wow," breathed Earwig in awe. Raisin started down the hall, walking rapidly with unusual energy. Caramon trailed behind. He'd seen enough dead men in his life and didn't particularly relish the sight of another. "Hey, Raist," he said, remembering. "What about your staff?" The mage turned around. The staff of mages was in his hand. "What about it?" he asked. The park where the attack had taken place was now well lit by lamps and torches, held by guardsmen wearing blue uniforms and tall helmets. They stood in a wide circle around the corpse, staring down at it, talking in low, horror-filled voices. None noticed the silent intrusion of the mage, creeping out of the shadows to stand behind them. What was left of Lord Mannion lay sprawled on the grass, his limbs twisted at odd angles. The head, it appeared, had nearly been torn from the body. "His neck's been broken," said one of the guards, "and his throat ripped open. In fact, most of his insides have been torn out, like a giant hand reached in and yanked him." Caramon peered over his brother's shoulder, felt his stomach turn. The big man looked away. He'd seen violent death before, but that was on the battlefield. Death by stealth by night made him sick. Earwig stared. He stood, twisting his ring, his usually cheerful face turning a dull leaden color. "Raislin," he said, gulping and tugging on the mage's sleeve. The mage silenced him with a glance. "A hand didn't do this," said another guard. "Leastwise, not a human hand. It was claws, gigantic claws." "Lady Chavas," spoke a voice that Caramon recognized as Lord Cal's. "You shouldn't be here. This is a gruesome sight." "I am counselor. It is my duty." Shavas stepped forward into the light. She stared at the grisly corpse on the ground, then put her hand over her mouth and turned away. The other council members, trailing along behind, pushed through the guards to view the body. "Brunswick, take the councillor home," ordered Lord Cal. The minister started to lead Shavas away when she suddenly looked up and saw Raistlin. "You!" she cried in a hollow voice. "What are these men doing here? Guards! I want them removed, now!" Lord Alvin commanded, pointing. Shavas recovered herself. "Please, Raistlin, leave us. This is a personal matter, a personal loss." One of the guards reached forward to grab the Major's arm, but a glance from the hourglass eyes stopped him in his tracks. Caramon took a step nearer to be ready if his brother needed assistance. Earwig, quiet and subdued, was still staring at the body. "Everything will be fine, Counselor," said Raistlin reassuringly. "We will say nothing about this to anyone." "But What are you doing here, wizard? How did you know about this man's death, unless you helped commit his murder?" demanded Lord Cal. "It's obvious he died as a result of some foul magical spell." "Is it?" the mage inquired with bland interest. "I suppose that explains the absence of blood?" The question caught them all by surprise. Shavas sucked in a whistling breath through her teeth. Lord Alvin pointed at the mage with a trembling hand. "Nobody ever died by violence in this town until you entered it." "Don't be a fool," said Raistlin. He glanced again at the corpse. The man obviously died while on his way to the meeting. I was with Councillor Shavas the entire time. "Mages can get others to do their dark deeds for them, or so I've heard," said Lord Cal grimly. "Others like their familiars, like giant cats." The councillor shot Cal a look so filled with venom that Caramon took a step back to avoid being poisoned by the glare. Raistlin turned. "Perhaps I should leave your city to its own devices." "I'm sure that will not be necessary, Raistlin," Shavas said. Gliding over to the mage, she put a hand on his robed shoulder, keeping her eyes averted from the horror on the ground. "Isn't that correct, Lord Cal?" The Lord tensed, as if afraid of some veiled threat. Clearing his throat, he said, "No, of course not." Shavas slumped, letting her body sag against Raistlin's. He put his arm around her, supporting her. "Raistlin," said Earwig urgently. "Not now." The mage didn't even glance at the candor. He and Shavas whispered together softly. Caramon watched his brother and the councillor, feeling something hot and angry stir deep inside him. Raistlin hated to be touched, and here he was, holding Shavas. How could he do this to me? The warrior demanded inwardly in frustration. He was about to say something. He didn't know for certain what, when he saw a cat move out from under a bush to stand next to a tree. The animal was regarding him with bright eyes that shone red in the torchlight. Caramon beckoned, and the cat darted forward. Standing on its hind paws, it clawed at his leg. "Well, at least someone loves me," said Caramon, recognizing his black-furred friend of the other afternoon. "You want to come up?" The cat leaped onto Caramon's shoulder, balancing perfectly. His brother and Chavez were still conferring. Raisin kept his arm around her. The warrior reached up to scratch the feline behind the ear. "There is a test I can make," Raisin said, moving away from the counselor, "to tell if the man died by magical means." He waved the staff of mages over the body, closing his eyes to prepare a spell. Chavez's terse voice broke his concentration. "We cannot allow you to do that, Master Mage. We have certain sacred rituals that must be performed before the body is interred in the ground." "I would not do anything that interferes with your religious beliefs." "I'm afraid I must insist. Please, Raisin." Choking back tears, Chavez put her hand to her necklace at her throat. "This is very difficult for me. He was a close friend." Raisin lowered his staff. "I'm sorry, Counselor. I've been thoughtless, it seems. Forgive me." Lady Chavez beckoned to a guardsman, then leaned over to speak softly into his ear. The soldier nodded once and ran off. "This evening has been a great strain on all of us," she said, addressing everyone in the park. "It is time for us all to return to our homes." The soldier came back, driving a carriage that he had commandeered. It was obvious to Caramel that this time they weren't going to be able to convince the fellow to wait for them outside. Raisin drew his hood up over his head. Taking his brother's arm, he said softly, "Come, Caramel, Earwig, let us go." The cat dug his claws into Caramel's shoulder, drawing a very small trickle of blood. "Ouch! Hey!" he exclaimed, attempting to dislodge the animal. The cat, however, would not be moved, but clung to Caramel tenaciously. They clambered into the carriage. Once Caramel was inside and seated, the cat jumped lightly from his shoulder and curled up in his lap, its red eyes fixed on the twin opposite. The carriage, driven by the soldier, rumbled through the empty, silent streets. "Raistlin," said Earwig in a small voice. "What is it, Candor?" the mage asked wearily. "That man. He's the one who tried to kill me." Caramel jerked his head up, staring. Raisin, however, did not move. "What do you think, Raist?" Caramel asked, feeling a chill of horror creep over his body. "I think," said the mage, "that we have one more day, my brother. One more day." Chapter 15. No one spoke during the carriage ride. No one made a sound except the cat, who purred loudly, rumbling like a small thunderstorm. Earwig sat in one corner of the carriage, scratching his hand. Raisin sat huddled in another, his cowl pulled low over his head. He might have been thinking or fast asleep. Caramel sat miserably, his broad shoulders spanning two corners, wishing he was back in Soleil's. "I'd ask Tanis about this mess," he said quietly to himself, a wave of homesickness sweeping over him. The half-elf was the wisest man Caramel knew, always calm and steady-going. Tanis rarely allowed anything to shake him, with the possible exception of the twins' older sister, Kitiara. Caramel heaved a great sigh. He wouldn't see Tanis again for a long time, perhaps ever, the way the world seemed to be falling headlong into darkness. They were supposed to meet again in 5, no, now make it 4 years' time. It seemed an eternity. Caramel sighed again. The cat licked his hand with its rough tongue. "Barnstoke Hall said the soldier driver. The carriage rolled to a halt. The companions climbed out, the soldier watching every step. It was obvious he wasn't going to leave until they were safely inside the inn. From the look of him, Caramon thought he might be planning to spend the night. The fighter, cat tucked under one arm, attempted to open the door of the hall, but discovered it was locked. He pounded on it loudly. Minutes passed, then the proprietor slid open a panel in the door and peered outside. Seeing the companions, he slid the panel shut. They waited another several moments, hearing bolts being drawn and chains rattling. Finally, the door opened a crack barely large enough for the warrior to squeeze through. The proprietor slammed the door shut again immediately after the three were inside. He was trembling so hard he could barely stand. "Forgive me, sirs, but there's been a terrible accident in town. Lord Mannion." "We know," snapped Rayson, moving past the man. "And it was no accident." Caramon noticed that his brother barely needed the assistance of the staff to walk anymore. Rayson's gait was strong, even after being up all hours of the night. He had not coughed once. The mage reminded Caramon so much of what he had been before the test that tears came to the warrior's eyes. He blinked them back and prayed to whatever gods were listening that this change would last. The cat in his arms suddenly began to wriggle and squirm. Jumping out of Caramon's grasp, it landed on the floor and sat there staring at him for a moment. Then, tail stuck straight up in the air, the cat wandered off, heading for the kitchen. The proprietor began bolting the door, chained it securely. Rayson climbed the stairs to their room. Caramon came after him, dragging Earwig, who was staring with professional interest at the numerous locks on the door. Arriving outside their room, Rayson held up a warning hand. Caramon kept hold of Earwig, who would have charged heedlessly ahead. "Wait," said the warrior. "Why?" Earwig asked, staring at Rayson. "Chirac." The mage held the beaming orb to the floor, stared intently underneath the door. "What's he doing? Checking for dust?" asked the Kandor. "Yeah, sort of," said Caramon. "It's all right," said Rayson, standing up. He held a rose petal in his hand. "This was where I left it. No one has passed." "You better let me go first, just in case," said Caramon, drawing his sword. The mage unlocked the door, and the warrior pushed it aside with his hand, both of them keeping well out of the way. Nothing happened. Carefully, Caramon entered the room. Rayson came after him, holding the light of his staff high. Earwig bounded in, hoping the rose petal had been wrong and that there might be something interesting inside. There wasn't. Rayson sank down on the bed and gave way to a sudden fit of coughing. He fumbled for his pouch of herbs. "It's gone." "What? What's gone?" "My herbal mixture. My pouch must have fallen off in the park." "I'll go," Caramon began. "No, don't leave me, brother." Rayson clutched his chest. "Besides, you never get out of the inn. Not the way it's locked up." "I'll go," said Earwig, jumping up and down with excitement. "I can get out." "Yes." Rayson nodded, sinking down on the bed. Send the candor. He shut his eyes. Hurry up, Caramon admonished Earwig sternly. No stop along the way. Not me. Opening the door, the candor darted out. They could hear his light footsteps racing down the hall and clattering down the stairs. Then silence. Raisin, drawing a deep breath, sat up briskly. Rising from the bed, he went to the window. Caramon stared at him. Raisin, what? Shh, my brother. The mage drew back the curtain, being careful to keep himself behind it. Yes, he said after a moment. There he goes. Now we may talk freely. You think Earwig's a spy? Caramon didn't know whether to burst into laughter or tears. I don't know what to think, Raisin answered gravely, except that he wears a magic ring and has no idea how he came by it. Or at least so he says. You've seen how strangely he's been acting. Caramon sat down heavily in a chair. Leaning his elbows on the table, he let his head sink into his hands. I don't like any of it. A man murdered, his body ripped apart, no blood, only a kind of brown dust, the candor wearing a magic ring. It's going to get worse, my brother, before it gets better. Reaching into his robes, Raisin brought out the bag of herbs and regarded it thoughtfully. He was growing stronger. There was no doubt about it. Was it his cure, or... Could you break a tree, Caramon? One of the trees in the park? He asked abruptly. What? Why do you want to know? One of the trees near the body of the murdered man had its bark shattered, as if someone struck it. Caramon thought, well, I suppose I could, if I were wearing a gauntlet to protect my fist. He shuddered as the full implications occurred to the warrior. Whoever did that terrible thing must be strong. Do you think it was a big cat? There were all those claw marks. It was either a cat, or we are meant to think it was a cat, said Raisin absently, preoccupied with other thoughts. He dragged a chair over to sit directly across from Caramon. What do you think of Lady Chalice? The question took Caramon by surprise. I think she's attractive. You find her irresistible. What do you mean? The fighter asked defensively. I mean, you have feelings for her. How do you know what my feelings are? Caramon demanded, rising to his feet and pacing about the room. He and his twin had never before discussed women. It had always been one part of Caramon's life in which Raisin had taken no interest. But then, never before had any woman been attracted to the thin and sickly young man. Recalling this, Caramon began to feel a certain amount of remorse. He could have any woman he wanted. It might be good for Raisin to, get to know the lady better. Perhaps that's what was working this miraculous cure. Love had been known to perform miracles. Look, Raist, said Caramon, sitting down again. If you want her, I'll back off. Want her? Raisin's golden eyes flared. He glared at his brother with such contempt that Caramon shrank away from him. I don't want her. Not in the vulgar sense, you mean. Yet the mage lingered over the word. His fingers stroked the wood of the table as if caressing smooth skin. Why did you bring her up then? I have been observing you. Ever since the first night we met her, you've been acting like a love-struck boy, staring at her with that stupid grin. The lady seems to like it, retorted Caramon. Yes, she does. Raislin's voice dropped. Caramon cast him an uneasy glance. What do you mean? Her house contains very ancient, very powerful tomes of magic. I must look at them alone. I don't like this race. Oh, but you will, my brother. I'm certain that you will. What if she won't go out with me? I've seen her looking at you, said Raisin. Caramon heard the bitterness in his brother's voice. I've seen her looking at you too, Raised, he said softly. Yes, well, Raisin let the comment pass. Caramon could have sworn he saw a faint flush of blood beneath the golden skin. To his surprise, his twin suddenly clenched both fists. The golden eyes glinted. The books, the magic, that's what's important. All else is fleeting. All else is of the flesh. A drop of sweat trickled down the Majore's brow. You will do it, he demanded hoarsely, not looking at his brother. Sure, Raised, said Caramon. It was what he answered to every request his twin made of him. Thank you, my brother. Raisin's tone was cold. You must be tired. I suggest you go to bed. Caramon shrugged. What about you? I have work to do. Raisin pulled the sextant out from under his robes, along with a date book to which he had referred earlier. Opening the text, he laid it on the table next to a quill and inkwell. The mage walked to the window and gazed at the heavens through the brass navigation tool. He began to take notes, drawing odd lines and strange curves, parallels of ink and words on parchment. Caramon, after watching a moment, went to bed. The mage was working so intently that he didn't hear the door open. Gosh, Raislin, you're up late. Feeling better? The Cantor's voice startled the mage. He glanced up, irritated by the disturbance. That was quick, he muttered, returning to his drawing. Oh, the soldier gave me a ride. He didn't know he gave me a ride, but I guessed he must be going back to the park. So I just jumped on behind the carriage, and off we went. It's a lot more fun than riding inside. When I got to the park, there was a big meeting going on. All the ministers were still there, and Councillor Chavas. Chavas? Raisin looked up again. Yes. Earwig gave a yawn that nearly split his head in two. I told her you dropped the pouch. She helped look for it, but we couldn't find it. I did find some others in case you're interested. The Cantor pulled numerous purses, mostly filled with money, out of his pockets and dumped them on the table. Along with them came a tiny scroll wrapped tightly in red ribbon. What is this? Raisin asked, lifting it. Oh, that's from Lady Chavas. She said I was to give it to Caramon. Raisin glanced at the bed where his brother lay sleeping. The mage untied the ribbon and unrolled the scroll. Dinner tomorrow evening. A private place known only to myself, where we can be alone. I will send my carriage for you at dusk. It was signed Chavas. Raisin dropped the note as if it had burnt him. Earwig was unrolling his sleeping mat. Oh, I found out something else, he said. yawning again. "The soldier was talking about it with one of his buddies. That man who was murdered, he didn't have a heart." Raisin sat staring at the note. "How fortunate for him," said the mage. Caramon awoke to find that his brother had fallen asleep at the table, his head lying on the books, his hand resting protectively over the sextant. "Raised," said Caramon, shaking him. The mage started and sat up swiftly. "Not yet. Now is not the time. I must be stronger." "Raised," said Caramon. The mage blinked and stared around, wondering where he was. Then, recognizing the room and his twin, he closed his eyes and sighed. "Oh, you're right. Did you get any sleep last night?" "Not much," Raisin conceded. "But that is not important. I now know the exact time." "Time for what?" "For when the 3 moons converge." Raisin spoke in hollow tones. Dark circles rimmed his eyes. "We have exactly 1 day, 1 night, and another day. Tomorrow night, when the darkness is deepest, it will be lit by the great eye." "What do we do now?" "Now we look for the cats. I can't believe they have simply vanished off the face of Kryn. Once we find them, we will hold the key to the mystery." "And tonight?" Caramon spoke reluctantly, hoping Raisin had either forgotten his instructions of the previous evening or had changed his mind. The big warrior just couldn't envision himself asking that lovely, regal woman to accompany him on an evening's romantic tryst. He had no doubt she would laugh at him. His twin pointed to a scroll rolled up and wrapped with red ribbon. "The candor brought that for you last night after you were asleep. It is from Lady Shabbos." Caramon felt the blood rush to his face. He reached for the scroll, opened it, and glanced at it. There was no need to read it to his twin. He knew Raisin would have looked at it last night. The warrior cleared his throat. He should feel elated, but he didn't. He felt cold all over. "It's like she's reading our minds." "Isn't it?" said Raisin, rising to his feet. "Wake Earwig. I need him." "You do?" Caramon stared astonished. "Yes." Raisin gave his brother a shrewd look. "Or let us say I need to know where he is and where he is not." Caramon, not understanding, shrugged and went to wake the candor. The warrior had absolutely no idea how to begin searching for missing cats, other than by dragging a string around and shouting, "Here, puss! Here, puss!" He had other, more important worries. The streets, previously so empty, were today crowded with people, talking about last night's murder. Their voices stopped whenever the red-robed mage came into view. Soon they started up again, this time finding a focus for their fear. "It was magic killed our lord. No one ever died until a wizard came to town. Likely killed our cats too." Caramon stalked the streets, hand on the hilt of his sword, glaring balefully at any who might have the nerve to speak too loudly or take a step toward Raisin. Whether it was the aura of mystery and power surrounding the magic user or the threat of the strong arm and sharp blade of the warrior beside him, nobody came close. The people melted away, sliding into alleys or ducking into dark, doorways. But Caramon heard the muttered threats and saw the hatred on the faces as he, his twin, and the Kender passed. They'd walked about half a mile from Barnstoke Hall, travelling on one of the three main thoroughfares of Mereklar, when Racing came to a stop. Now, instructions. Earwig, I have a spell that will lead us to the cats, but in order to cast it, I need a bag full of a certain herb, Nepeta Cataria. When you find it, meet us back at Barnstoke Hall. Earwig leaped at Racing, clutching at him, nearly knocking him over. No, please don't make me leave you. I really want to stay with you. I feel afraid if I'm not with you.
Hey, let go, Caramon said, dragging the Kender off his brother. What's got into you? Kender aren't afraid of anything.
Don't make me leave you, Caramon. Earwig was clinging to the big man's arm despite all Caramon's efforts to shake him loose. Please, I'll behave. Racing's hands slipped into his pouch. He drew out a handful of rose petals and slowly sifted them over the Kender's head. Astasarak Sinuran Krinawi, he murmured. Earwig suddenly yawned and began to rub his eyes. I'll be good. The Kender's fingers slipped off Caramon's arm. Earwig crumpled over in a heap on the sidewalk.
What happened?
Caramon knelt down beside his little friend. He's all right, my brother, said Racing. He's asleep. Earwig had begun to snore softly. Lift him up onto that bench so that no one steps on him, Racing instructed. Now you and I can proceed with our search alone. The Mage's gaze went to the ring on the Kender's hand. Caramon did as he was told. They left Earwig blissfully snoring in a Hiava shop.
What was that stuff you wanted him to get? Some kind of herb?
Nepeta Cataria. The mage smiled slightly. Catnip. The brothers continued up the street, appearing to do nothing more than look in shop and store windows. But all the stores were empty. The houses had their windows shuttered. People roamed the streets, sharing their own fear and panic.
It's like a town under siege,
Caramon remarked. Precisely. And for much the same reason. Fear, terror. And notice, added Racing, no cats anywhere.
Caramon glanced around. You're right. I haven't seen one. Have they all disappeared?
I don't think so. I think they're in hiding. They too are afraid. Caramon wondered at their destination. Racing seemed to have an exact idea of where he was going and walked without hesitation. The warrior thought he understood when he saw the park, the same park Lord Mannion had been killed in the night before. No one was around, the townspeople avoiding the place as if it were infected with the plague.
What are we doing here?
Caramon asked uncomfortably, having much the same impression himself. His brother did not answer. The mage stopped near a bench. Leaning on his staff, he stared at the trampled grass. Caramon, growing increasingly nervous, pulled out the yellow ball Maggie had given him and began to play with it, trying to distract his gloomy thoughts. But thinking of Maggie made him think of Shabbos. He knew he should be looking forward to tonight. What man wouldn't, being alone with a beautiful, desirable woman? But there was the knowledge in the back of Caramon's mind
that he was using the woman, deceiving her. He was a diversion, nothing more. He didn't like it, and he had about decided to tell Raisin he wasn't going when he felt a light tugging at his hand. Caramon looked down. The black cat, sitting on its hind legs, was batting at the ball. "Hello," Caramon said, bending over to pick up the cat. The feline bounded sideways, ears and tail twitching. The warrior shrugged his shoulders and sat down on the bench, shutting his eyes against the morning glare. The cat brushed up against his legs. "All right, I'll pet you," he said, leaning down. The cat turned and walked away, craning its neck back to regard the fighter with reflecting eyes. Caramon shook his head. "What a strange animal." Raisin seemed to wake from a dream. He stared at the cat intently. "Isn't that the same cat who came with us last night? The one you had on your shoulder?" "I guess so. It's the only black cat I've seen in town." Raisin watched it. He wanted us to follow. "How can you tell?" The cat dashed off, then dashed up to Caramon again. The warrior took a step after it, and it ran off again. "Let's see where it takes us," said Raisin. The cat raced ahead of them about 20 feet, heading around the park to the western portion of the city. Just when it seemed that they would lose the animal, it stopped, waiting for them, sitting on the ground patiently. When the twins were within arm's reach, the cat darted off again, moving in the same direction. "Where do you think he's leading us?" Caramon asked. "If I knew that, we wouldn't be following it," Raisin snapped. The brothers went up street after street until even the mage became lost in the flow of alleys, avenues, and paths. Every time the twins came within a few feet of the black cat, it would dart off, staying always ahead, always within sight. It never uttered a sound, but gazed back with eyes that held the sunlight as brilliantly as a blue orb on Raisin's staff. Caramon craned his neck back, staring into the sky as he walked. "It's almost noon," he said. "I hope we arrive at whatever we're going soon." "I think we must be getting closer," Raisin said. "The animal has increased its speed." "Do you recognize this part of the city?" "No. I take it you don't either." Caramon shook his head. They were on a boulevard surrounded by buildings, shops, and houses that looked abandoned or unused. Trash filled several alleys that cut through the blocks like great wounds, darkened and dirty. Even the white stones of the city appeared gray, worn, and old. "This is very odd." Raisin pulled his cowl back, staring at the black windows. "Yeah, this place feels dead." Caramon spoke softly, uneasily, though it seemed there was no one around. "A part of the city that died and was never buried. Look, our friend has evidently found what it wanted us to see." The black cat was scratching at a sewer cover near the sidewalk on the right. The twins walked wearily up to the feline. It did not run away, as it had before, but continued scratching, voicing a harsh meow. "It wants us to go down there," Raisin realized. Pointing with a long, thin finger, he commanded, "Lift the grating, Caramon." The warrior glanced at his brother. "Into a sewer? Are you sure, Raist?" The cat screeched loudly. "Do as I say," Raisin hissed. The huge warrior bent down, grasping the metal cover with both hands, and began to lift, his muscles straining. His face turned red with effort, and his expression distorted into one of concentration and exertion. After a few moments, the plate grated and he dragged it aside. The cat stared at the brothers intently, cocking its head sideways, flicking its eyes toward the street and back up at them. Without warning, the animal leaped down into the hole, disappearing into the darkness. Cameron wiped sweat from his forehead. He stared down into the impenetrable hole. It was like looking into the abyss. He fancied he could feel icy talons reach out, grasping to drag him down to the realm of death. He shuddered, standing back. "Do we really have to go down there?" Raisin nodded confirmation. The mage's face was rigid. It seemed he was subject to the same impressions as his brother, but he started forward. "Better let me go first," said Caramon. The warrior forced himself to approach the lip of the pit. Kneeling, he took several deep breaths and then lowered himself into the hole. His legs were swallowed by a shadow that slowly engulfed his arms and, finally, his head. Gathering his robes around him, Raisin prepared to descend beneath Mereklar. "Hey, you! Either drink or move on!" Earwig opened his eyes to see the irate face of a tavern owner glaring down at him. "No loitering!" "I wasn't loitering," said the Candors indignantly. "I was napping, although," he added, brushing rose petals out of his hair, "I don't remember having taken a nap since I was a very small Candor. But I was up late last night, so maybe that explains it. Now, I wonder where Raistlin and Caramon have got to." At first Earwig was terribly worried that he couldn't find his friends, but then the uncomfortable feeling went away, leaving him more cheerful than he'd felt in days. The small, irritating voice inside him quit nagging him to do this, do that. And there was no longer the threat that if he didn't do what the voice said, he'd be dragged off to some place where there were no locks to pick, no pouches to find, no people to meet. Some place eternally boring. Now that he was away from Raisin and Caramon, Earwig felt carefree and happy again, and he began doing things that all Candor do best. Explore. Earwig walked up the street, gazing about with interest. Some of the people associating him with the mage whispered to each other that the little man with the pointed ears might be a demon. They drew away from him, pushing their children into their houses, closing and barring doors in his face. "How rude," said Earwig. Shrugging his shoulders, he walked on, tapping the wooden hopak on the ground with a steady, hollow rhythm. "I've been here before, haven't I?" he asked himself aloud. He had come to an intersection and saw a narrow alley that led to an arcade. "I remember. This is where I went to the first night. I was here. That's the inn where the man tried to kill me and the girl kissed me." Earwig walked into the market. None of the shops were open, and only a few nervous people walked through the alley, anxious to finish their business and return to the safety of their homes. "Hello there," a bright young voice said. Earwig glanced around. "Do you remember me? You helped me the other night. I didn't get a chance to ask your name. Mine's Catherine. What's yours?" "Earwig Lockpicker," the Candor said, holding out his small hand. Is this how Caramon greets a girl? He wondered, trying to remember. I never got a chance to thank you either. You ran away before I could say anything. May I buy you a drink? I work right over there, Catherine said, pointing to the inn. Our house specialty is Stonewash Surprise. Stonewash Surprise? I've never heard of it, Earwig replied. Oh, only the hardiest adventurers have ever tried it, and lived, Catherine added, giggling. The tavern was as large and dirty as the Candor remembered. Beer and other unmentionable stains darkened the floor. The walls were constructed from ill-fitting planks of wood that were knotted and rotting with age. Catherine walked behind the bar and began to pour liquors into her glass, filling the cup from decanters of red, green, and blue. The drink complete, she pushed it in front of Earwig, who sat at one of the many mismatched stools. He took a sip, and his eyes widened. "Celebration punch!" he exclaimed in recognition. "Kind of." "Celebration punch? What's that?" Catherine asked. "It's what Candor used to celebrate with, of course." Earwig looked around. "You're not doing much business today." The bar was in fact empty except for the Candor and the young women. "It's the murder," Catherine said matter-of-factly. "Everyone's scared to death. I say good riddance." "Yes, I remember. He was the man who hit you." Earwig sipped his drink. "You know, it's funny. Lord Mannion came in here a lot, and he generally got drunk, but he was always a gentleman. Many nights I've made certain he reached his home safely, but then just the past few weeks, he changed. He turned." The girl frowned, thinking, "Ugly, cruel. It was when he started wearing that necklace, like the one you're wearing." "What necklace?" "Oh, this," said Earwig, glancing down at the silver cat's caul with the ruby eyes. "You're not going to turn mean, are you?" "Gee, do you think there's a chance I might?" Earwig asked eagerly. Catherine began to laugh. "No, I'm sorry I don't." "I didn't think so." Earwig sighed. The Candor ran through a list of things to say to women as he tugged at the gold ring on his finger. He chose one he thought appropriate and asked, "What's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this?" Catherine giggled. "It's just my job. One of them." "How many do you have?" "2 or 3, depending on business. I work at Java Tavern on Westgate Street." "I hope it's not as rough as this place." "Phew, I can take care of myself. I'll bet you've been to a lot of places," Catherine said wistfully. "Oh my, yes, all around Kryn. Southern Urgoth, Northern Urgoth, Salamia." "I've never been anywhere but here." Earwig looked intently at the woman across the bar from him. She stood straight and strong, her arms well muscled. He believed that she could handle herself in almost any situation. "You remind me a little of someone I know. Her name's Skitiara." "Really? What's she like?" "She's a fierce and cunning warrior," said the Candor. Catherine looked a little shocked. "Why, thank you, Earwig. I think—" "You sound like you want to leave this place." The Candor took several gulps of his drink. "Why don't you just pick up and go?" "I don't have the steel yet." "You don't need money to travel. All you need is a hopak and a good walking tune." Earwig laughed, swinging his hopak into the air. He was feeling really good. He couldn't remember ever having felt this good before. Catherine shrugged and frowned. She leaned back from her guest, propping her elbows against a shelf. "I'm sorry, Catherine. I didn't mean to make you unhappy." Earwig rummaged through his pockets, pulling out the first thing he came to, the tangle of wire with a bead in it. "Here, I want you to have this." The barmaid, smiling in spite of herself, reached over to take the gift. Holding the wire up to the light, she stared at it in fascination. "What is it?" "I don't know. I got it when I was on some adventure with my friends. We go adventuring a lot together, my friends and I. One of them is a magic user," the Kender added importantly. "This is really amazing, Earwig." Catherine was still staring at the wire. "If you look closely, it appears that the bead has writing on it." Earwig heard the door open behind him, but he didn't turn around. He was trying to remember how Caramon got girls to kiss him. Catherine glanced up and hurriedly tucked the wire away in a pocket. She nodded once and then leaned over the bar, her face close to the Kenders. "Tell me about your friends," she said. "Tell me about the mage. I'd love to meet him." "Raistlin and Caramon, they were born in a place called Solis, to the east of here. Caramon is a great and powerful warrior. His muscles are as big as that," Earwig said, pointing to a beer barrel in the corner. "I've seen him cut 20 men in two with one stroke." "No, really?" Catherine appeared nervous. She seemed to have to force her eyes to remain on the Kender. Earwig blinked. Leaning over, he said confidentially, "Don't look now. Cat. Whatever. But your walls are spinning around and around." "You don't need another drink, that's all. Tell me about your other friend." "My other friend's name is Raistlin. He has skin that shines like gold and eyes the shape of hourglasses. He sees death," the Kender said, and solemnly sticking his nose in his drink. "But as frightening as that sounds, even more frightening are the spells he casts and powers he can call down to destroy enemy. There used to be a wizard who lived in the hills to the east," Catherine said, darting a swift glance behind the Kender. "What's his name?" "Nobody knows, but it's rumored that his cave is still there. It's built around a series of stones that look like an animal's paw." The walls were spinning more rapidly, and now the ceiling had joined in. Much to Earwig's fascination, he sat on the stool watching them revolve around and around. And then the stool joined the wild dance, spinning the Kender around and round, until Earwig suddenly discovered that he was lying on the floor. A man dressed in black leather armor loomed over him, knelt beside him. Strong hands lifted the Kender and flung him over a massive shoulder. "You won't hurt him?" Catherine's voice floated around the Kender like a lovely cloud. "No," said a harsh voice in reply. "Like our Lord told you, the little fellow's in danger, wearing that necklace around in the open. We want to protect him, that's all. Thank you for your help." Earwig, bobbing up and down against the man's back, started to feel incredibly dizzy. He stared bleary-eyed at Catherine, who seemed to be growing smaller and smaller and smaller. "One celebration punch for the road," cried the Kender and passed out.
Ooh! What is it, Caramon? There's a stream running through here. It's as cold as ice. You better let me carry you. Raisin climbed down the stairs and plunged into the water. Nonsense. Don't worry about me. I'm fine. Caramon peered into the darkness, trying to locate his twin. Are you sure? I mean, I know how much you hate getting wet and cold. I said I'm fine, the mage snapped irritably. If the cold bothers you so much, perhaps you would like me to carry you? No, of course not. Caramon felt foolish. Shirak. The soft white light of the staff of mages filled the tunnel. A long, dark passage extended ahead of them, far beyond the summoned field of magical light. The walls glistened wetly. It smells bad, said Caramon, but not quite what I expected from a sewer. It smells like iron. He sounded disbelieving. Or blood, said Raisin softly. Yeah. There was no room to swing a sword. Caramon drew a dagger from its sheath. Its blade gleamed in the light of the staff. We must therefore assume that this is not a sewer, but a connection to a waterway, Raisin added. The cat meowed impatiently, and the mage walked forward, moving past his brother. Caramon started to protest. He always took the point when the two walked into danger together. But he remembered then that Raisin carried the light. He kept close behind him. The cat moved slowly, ensuring that his followers would not become lost in what Caramon soon discovered was a maze of tunnels. The feline didn't appear to like the water any better than the warrior, for it shook its paw with each step and seemed to grimace at setting a foot back into the stream. They walked for what seemed like miles, though something in the back of Caramon's mind insisted that they had not gone any great distance at all. What are you saying, Caramon? I said we could use a dwarf now, the warrior replied. I wish I could see better. Anything could jump out at us. I don't sense any threat to ourselves down here. The only feeling I get from this place is that it is old. Very, very old. Old and forgotten. I agree, my brother. It is most unusual. They walked and walked. The chill water seeped through Caramon's boots. He was shivering and worried about his twin, knowing that Raisin's robes must be soaked through. The warrior knew better, however, than to ask. The cat made a sudden turn, darting down another passage that angled off from the first. The new passage was equally as black as the old. Caramon hesitated, but the cat meowed, urging them to come forward. Without hesitation, Raisin walked on, holding the staff at eye level, able to raise it no higher because of the low roof. Come, Caramon. Don't fall behind. They came to an intersection, and the black cat skipped on, moving to the left, beginning to run, splashing through the water. The brothers increased their pace, both prompted by curiosity. Which killed the cat? Caramon said under his breath. The tunnels became a dizzying maze, a labyrinth created for some unknown purpose. Raisin held the staff of mages forward, a lance of light piercing the dark. Caramon sloshed along behind. He noticed that the walls were beginning to change, becoming drier. Look at that, Raisin breathed, holding up the staff.
The wall was covered with paintings and engravings, showing sights neither brother could identify. They moved swiftly on, left and right, straight and back, a curving tunnel leading to a crooked passage leading to a sloping floor. The cat moved faster. The twins rounded a corner behind it and stopped suddenly, staring wide-eyed.
"Name of the abyss!"
Caramon cried aloud, steadying himself against the cavern entrance with his hand. Raisin said nothing, but simply stared in the staff's soft radiance. The black cat turned to face him, eyes red in the staff's light. The chamber in which they stood was huge, hundreds of feet long. Numerous passages led in and out, black gashes in the rock. Small rivers collected in ponds that glittered with an oily reflection, and everywhere they looked, they saw the cats of Mereklar. Thousands of cats lay resting on their sides without sound, without motion. Raisin knelt down, holding the staff close. "Look," he said, pointing. From every mouth and nose poured a small stream of blood.
They're all dead,"
Caramon gasped. Raisin examined one of the small bodies, putting a thin golden hand on tiger-striped fur. He stroked it gently. He moved to another body, then another, lifting heads and peering into shining eyes.
"I don't understand," Caramon said softly. "What could have killed them all? Poison?"
"They're not dead."
"They sure look dead to me."
"I assure you they're quite alive. However, their minds are gone." Caramon went to the nearest cat and touched its fur. He felt warmth under his hand, a tiny heart still beating, breath barely entering and leaving. The black cat leaped in front of him, hunching down on its forepaws. It spat at him.
"All right."
Caramon rose to his feet and backed away.
"I'm not going to hurt them. You're right, Rist. They are alive."
"In answer to your first question, they were not poisoned. There is no poison I know of that could do this."
"What do you think it was?"
"The only answer I have is magic, though a spell that could cause this kind of destruction is beyond my means." Caramon paused, considering the implications.
"Then you think this is the work of a wizard?"
"A wizard of extraordinary power, perhaps greater than Parcelian." Caramon shivered, recalling the powerful master of the Tower of High Sorcery. The black cat watched and listened intently to the brothers' talk, never taking its bright, reflecting eyes from them. Raisin raised his arms and began to speak the strange, spidery language of magic. The room glowed, a dull purple aura that covered everything, including the corridor through which they had walked. "There," the mage said in satisfaction. "We can return here whenever we wish." He turned to go.
"But
there's nothing more we can do. I cannot save these cats. I must go back to my room and think. And you, if you will remember, have an engagement tonight." Raisin headed down the corridor. Caramon stood looking back, a sadness in his heart. Removing the yellow sequined ball from his pocket, he lay it down gently on the blood-wet floor.
"I'm sorry,"
he started to say to the black cat, but it was gone. Chapter 16.
"I wonder where Earwig is. Maybe he got lost,"
Caramon said, straightening the room. His mother had always made him clean up after himself, and the fighter did not let old habits die.
Candor never get lost, perhaps because they never truly know where they are.
Raisin sat at the desk in front of the window in the companion's room, writing something on a roll of parchment. Caramon, when he was through with his own cleaning, did his brother's. The mage was also unwilling to let old habits die.
What are you doing?
The red cowl was pulled back from Raisin's face, allowing the afternoon sun to fall on his golden features. He rested his quill, scowling at Caramon with a sideways glance before returning to his work. If you must know, I'm asking Lady Chavas for access to her library tonight.
Well, that's great,
Caramon said, heartily relieved. Why that tone, my brother?
It's just I thought...
You thought I was going to sneak into her house like a thief?
Oh, well...
The fighter began uncomfortably. You're a dolt, Caramon. The big man kept silent. Usually his twin was the more intuitive of the two, but this time Caramon knew precisely what his brother was feeling. The pangs of jealousy were sharp and left festering wounds. Raisin finished his writing and sat, waiting for the ink to dry. A knock on the door startled them both. Were you expecting anyone, Caramon?
No,
said the warrior, sliding his sword from his scabbard.
You?
No. Enter, Raisin called out. The messenger, instead of opening the door, slid something under the crack between frame and floor. Footsteps retreated rapidly away from the room. The mage retrieved the message, breaking the wax seal with a loud snapping sound. Turning to the light at the window, he held the parchment in both hands, reading.
What is it?
The warrior asked, still holding the sword. It is a letter from Lady Chavas. She's waiting for you downstairs, Raisin said in even tones. Caramon saw that his brother's golden hands trembled.
Anything else?
Raisin crumpled the message into a ball. It says that I may use the counselor's library tonight. I am so very glad you could accept my offer for this evening, Caramon, said the counselor of Mereklar. The two sat in Chavas's private carriage, guided by her personal driver.
My pleasure,
Caramon stammered, gazing at his companion across a gulf that stretched between their seats. Chavas wore a gown similar to the one she had worn when the companions first met her, only this one left her white shoulders bare. She had wrapped around her a silk shawl, the black one, Caramon noted nervously, with a lace pattern woven into the fabric, fringe hanging from the ends. From her neck hung the opal pendant.
Are you cold, my lady? You may have my cloak,
the warrior offered, thinking his gesture gentlemanly. Before Chavas could answer, he unclasped the black cloak from around his neck and tossed it clumsily over her body. Straightening the folds, Caramon accidentally touched the woman's neck, her skin as soft as delicate clouds. He felt her warmth, a flush of life beneath his fingers.
Sorry,
he apologized, blushing and returning to his seat. Chavas smiled, arranging his cloak around her. The red inner lining of the fighter's cloak made the woman seem magical, as dark and glittering as the 3 moons of Kryn.
I'm being a real dolt, just like Raisin said,
Caramon thought with chagrin.
Why can't I relax when I'm with her?
I've never felt this way around any woman before. It's because she's a lady, a true lady, the most beautiful I've ever seen, just like the royal ladies in the stories about the knights of Solamnia. Sturm, my old friend, how would you act? How does a knight treat a lady?
Caramon didn't realize that he was staring at her until he saw Shavas lower her head, her cheeks mantling with a faint flush.
Oh, I'm sorry. I know I'm acting like an idiot, but I can't help it. You're so lovely,
Caramon stammered. Thank you, my brave warrior, Shavas said. Reaching out to him almost shyly, she allowed her fingers to brush against his hand. He trembled at her touch. I'm so glad you could come with me tonight. You helped me forget about... The woman shivered. Her face became pale.
Don't talk about it,
said Caramon firmly. No, you're right, I won't. Shavas lifted her head bravely. And I have nothing to fear, have I? Not with you by my side?
I would die before I let any harm come to you, Lady Shavas.
The counselor smiled again at the sincerity in the big man's voice. Her hand grasped his, tightening around his strong fingers. Thank you, she said, but I much prefer you alive. Desire flashed through Caramon. His blood burned. All thoughts of royal ladies vanished from his mind. She was a woman, and now he knew just what to do. He tried to pull Shavas near, but she suddenly snatched her hand away. Leaning back in the carriage, she glanced languidly out the window. Caramon, wrestling with his passion, thought it best to do the same. The lights of the city shone, as they always did, bright stars above the streets. The few people shuffling along the sidewalks of Mereklar tipped their hats and bowed as they passed. Caramon watched Shavas smile and nod to the citizens in turn, but he thought her smile seemed strained. The coach turned left on another street and entered a large park surrounded by a fence of thick trees and hedges. At one end of the park stood a small building.
Is this where we're going?
Caramon asked, his heart pounding. The place seemed deserted. If you don't like it, we can go elsewhere, the counselor said coolly.
Oh, no, this is fine,
the warrior replied. The carriage pulled alongside the building, and Caramon jumped down, holding out his hands. He lifted Shavas by her slim waist, pressing her warm body next to his as he lowered her to the ground. The black shawl fluttered like wings. Thank you, Caramon, she said, lingering near him for an instant. Good evening, Counselor Shavas. I'm so glad you have arrived on time, someone said in a high voice. Startled, Caramon whipped around. Behind him stood a thin man wearing a black coat. He was visibly nervous, casting his gaze up and down the street. Are you sure you wish to have dinner here tonight, my lady? The servants refuse to come after dark, and... Thank you, Robert. This will be fine. Shavas interrupted smoothly. Shall I show you the way, madam? Robert asked, hands clasped together. The counselor shook her head slightly and smiled. No, I think we can find our own way. Very good, madam, Robert replied. Bowing again, he turned on his heel and left the travellers. Don't wait, Shavas told the carriage driver.
When shall I return for you, my lady?
Shavas glanced at Caramon from the corner of her eye. Tomorrow morning, she said softly. Caramon thought the beating of his heart might suffocate him.
The two walked around the little building that he assumed from the smell was a kitchen. They came to what appeared to be an entrance into a park. The fighter's eyes adjusted to the darkness. He saw a cloth spread on the ground, and he realized that they were going to dine outdoors. He glanced around uneasily. What a great place for an ambush. The memory of the corpse he had seen last night almost made him turn and run. Shava slipped her hand through his arm, walking close beside him. This is one of my favorite places. It allows me to be a little more relaxed, that I can be at home. Then I can be at home, she whispered into Caramon's ear, bringing her soft cheek next to his. The area was prepared when they arrived. Robert added several black pillows, placing them into comfortable positions around the white spread. 2 silver candlesticks stood in the middle, scented tapers burning with a warm light. Plates and trays held fresh fruits and warm meats. 2 crystal glasses filled with sparkling red wine waited to be sipped. Chavas led Caramon to the cloth. Letting go of his hand, she sank to the pillows opposite him, stretching her lithe body comfortably. Please sit down, she said, gracefully indicating a mound of cushions. Clumsily the fighter sat, crossing his legs under him, his tall boots creaking. You look splendid, Caramon. Chavas's compliment made the fighter flush. Oh, thank you, he said, unsure if he could return the compliment or merely accept gracefully. Well, this is a very nice spot you've picked out. It's very, Private, the woman finished for him. As Councillor of Mereklar, I'm constantly called upon to stand in the public eye. But even I have needs, and one of them is occasional privacy. It sounds like you lead a very busy life. Caramon gulped at his wine. Yes, very busy and very lonely. Chavas lowered her eyes. Her lashes cast long shadows, and a tear slid down her cheek. Caramon longed to take her in his arms, but he couldn't figure out how to get around the food on the plates. Staring at her glass, Chavas held it up to the candle's flame. The councillor suddenly blinked her eyes and frowned, shaking her head as if awakening from a dream. A toast, she said clearly, to you and your brother. And the success of our mission, Caramon added loudly. This seemed to take the women by surprise. Of course, she said, to success. They sipped at the same time. Caramon would have downed his glass in one motion had he not seen his companion put her glass down, still mostly full. Are you hungry? The councillor asked, reaching across the cloth to take the warrior's plate. Without waiting for an answer, she began dishing up food, selecting meat and fruit and fish. She took some herself, though nowhere near the same amount. Caramon searched for forks and spoons, but found nothing, grew nervous, wondering if he'd missed something again. Chavas saw his worry. Eat with your hands, Caramon. Nobody's watching. We're completely, absolutely alone. The woman took a berry between her fingers and brought it slowly up to her mouth, licking a drop of juice. The fighter looked on, felt heat rise to his face. He'd been hungry before they sat down, but now he wondered if he could eat a mouthful. He never in his life wanted a woman as much as he wanted this one. Neither said anything during the meal. Both seemed only to be waiting with anticipation for it to end. When they finished, Chavas wiped her fingers on a silk napkin. Robert appeared, seemingly from out of nowhere, and began clearing away plates. "When you are finished, you may leave," said Chavas, her gaze fixed on Caramon. "Thank you, my lady," said Robert in obvious relief. "Now, Caramon," said Chavas, "what shall we talk about?"
"Talk?"
The fighter returned, startled and disappointed. He'd had other ideas in mind.
"Oh, I don't know. What do you want to talk about?"
Chavas poured herself another glass of wine. "Tell me about yourself. Tell me about one of your adventures." The fighter thought of the stories he usually told in taverns of blood and guts and cold steel.
"I doubt any tales I know would interest you, my lady,"
he mumbled, almost tipping over his wine. Grabbing it, he downed the glass at a swallow. "You might be surprised," she said. "But if you don't want to talk of battle, tell me about your brother. Tell me about Raistlin."
"Aha!"
Caramon shifted restlessly, jealously. Now he'd found her true interest.
"Raced? What do you want to know about him?"
"Tell me what he's like. He's very young to have such power, isn't he?"
"He's the first of his age to pass the test at the Towers of High Sorcery,"
said Caramon reluctantly, not wanting to think or talk about that terrible time. "Truly?" Chavas prompted. "It must have been a frightening experience."
"It was. Those who don't pass the test die."
Chavas, seeing him growing uncomfortable, smiled to herself and changed the subject. "Have you and your brother journeyed together long?"
"All of our lives,"
Caramon said softly, staring at the empty glass in his hands.
"We're never apart."
"Except when each of you goes in search of what he truly desires." Chavas rose gracefully to her feet. Bringing her arms up over her head, she undid the braids coiled around her head, released cascading waves of soft brown hair. Caramon watched her, his desire a physical pain.
"I long to hear the epiphany of your woman's crown and play upon its shining strands,"
he whispered. The counselor bent down, kneeling in front of her guest. Bringing her cheek close to Caramon's mouth, she nestled near him. "That's beautiful. Did you make it up?"
"No,"
the fighter replied, clasping her in his arms, drawing her down to lie beside him in the cool grass.
"It's something Race used to say. I think he read it in a book. He's always reading books."
Chavas brought her hand up to caress his face, brushing the backs of her long, perfect fingernails against his rough skin. "Say it to me again, Caramon," she whispered, but he knew she didn't really want to hear the quote, which was good because he couldn't for the life of him remember it. Raistlin sat on the couch in Chavas's library, flipping absently through the book Caramon had glanced over 2 evenings ago. Noting the blank pages, he tossed it aside in contempt. The counselor had left the door to her estate open, allowing the mage access. Her note did not say when she would return. Raistlin, knowing Caramon's prowess, decided that the lady probably wouldn't be back until morning. The mage stifled a small flame of jealous desire that threatened to engulf him in a raging fire. "The magic," he said to himself. "Never forget what is important." Raistlin rose to his feet, preparing to cast a spell. His chant began as a low murmuring, a song that filled the room with indescribable music. His left hand opened wide, then closed, fingers opening again in patterns of power, drawing strength from Kryn and the unseen plains. He raised the black staff high into the air, arm straight, bringing it slowly back against his robed body, curving it in an arc to his side. In answer to his command, 3 books began to glow. Knowing the spell wouldn't last long, Raistlin marked in his memory their location and sat back down on the couch. He drew a deep, shivering breath. Staring at his treasure, his body too ached with desire. Gathering and calming his thoughts, he moved slowly to the bookshelf. Reached up a trembling hand and pulled down the first text. It was entitled Mereklar. Below that was inscribed, "The Lord of the Cats." What's this? Raistlin studied the brown cover, frowning. It appeared that the second half of the title had been added on in haste, as if the binder had been given a last-minute instruction. He placed it on the table near the fire, sitting down in the wooden chair, opening the book to the first page. Among the illuminations of red, blue, and gold were scrawling letters written by an unknown, unnamed scholar of ages past. The origins of Mereklar are unknown, and will remain unknown until such time as it needs to be discovered. The purpose of the city is clear and final, and those within know its reasons. The cats must live here, for their purpose will be known when the time is come. "What nonsense!" the mage snarled. "I expected magical spells, not a tour guide." He turned to another page and found a picture of a black-skinned man dressed in black clothes, standing in front of a blasted cityscape. Lightning cracked against an orange sky, and 3 moons formed a great eye in the unnatural air. The street looked familiar to Raistlin, but he couldn't immediately place it. Underneath the painting was the caption, "The Lord of Cats in his realm of despair, waiting stealthy and black for the gate to open." "Interesting, very interesting," said Raistlin, his anger gone. He began to carefully turn the ancient parchments one by one until he reached the end of the book. "This certainly puts matters in a different light than the prophecies would have it. The Lord of Cats brings his demons, will lead the cats against the world, destroys the city that stands before the first gods, slays those who bring harm to his dominion, agent of evil." Reaching the end, Raistlin brought his index fingers to his lips. It was of interest, certainly, but it wasn't in the least magical. What had caused it to respond to his spell? "I have never come across anything like this before. And what am I to believe? The legends of the city or the facts in this book?" He replaced the text on the shelf, going to the next of the 3 he had discovered. Lifting his hand to the top shelf, he noticed another book on the ledge. The title was Tanis Half-Elven. "Fascinating, but unfortunately not important," Raistlin remarked. Taking the text, he originally wandered back to the table. He lifted the black fraying cover and turned to the opening page. The accounts of the mage Ali Azra of the Shining Plains, the city of the White Stone. Ha! Rayson breathed in excitement. The tales of the supposedly mad wizard Ali Azra of the mythical Shining Plains were among his favorites, combining magical texts with entertaining stories. He had read them against the commands of his masters, who maintained that the information was too advanced and dangerous for a young mage's comprehension. But that had never stopped Rayson, who found Azra's techniques fascinating, though his style was rather irritating. Long have I studied the stones of Mereklar, longer even than when I studied the pillars of Isklangard. Rayson smiled at the mention of Isklangard. The chronicle was the first he had ever read, and like the pillars, many fantastic things have I learned, which I now lay down upon these pages for my children to know. Among my children I list. Rayson skipped ahead. Ali Azra never failed to list every one of his pupils. The mage flipped pages until he found the first chapter heading. The walls, symbols of purity. The walls of the fantastic and wonderful city of Mereklar surround the land with 3 great barriers against evil. The white marble is a warning to those who would bring harm upon the inhabitants. Inscribed on the walls of the fantastic and wonderful city of Mereklar are the legends and tales of the world, Kryn, and other places that even I, the great and powerful mage Ali Azra, must confess I have only glimpsed briefly, hardly long enough to give full and accurate accountings, as I am sure you, gentle reader, would desire. Rayson scowled. Gentle reader was a term he detested. When you follow in my illustrious footsteps, as I am sure you shall, wanting to become more familiar with my greatness, desiring to taste of the power which I now freely command, you will find that the walls of the fantastic and wonderful city of Mereklar cannot be scratched by any force, and no spell of good intent or evil can affect it. Why is this, you ask, and ask you should, for in the knowing there is power. Let it be known that I, the great and powerful mage Ali Azra, know the origins of the city of Mereklar, and they are that the incomparable gods of good, among them numbered Paladine, Majere, and Mishakal, with whom I have had the pleasure of conversing, sent the city to the land, commanding that it not be harmed by element or man. All right, Rayson muttered impatiently. If the gods of goods did create Mereklar, what was their purpose? The magician read further into the book, hoping to discover an answer to his question. However, he learned nothing of interest, merely accounts of Azra's journeys and wanderings, occasionally mentioning the city, though without giving any useful information. The wizard hadn't even bothered to include a useful spell. Slamming shut the account of the mad mage, Rayson placed it back on the shelf. Going to the third and final text, he pulled out a volume covered in red velvet, darkened by age. The title was simple, Arcanus, a name found on many magical treatises. Walking back to the table, Rayson opened to the first page and his eyes widened as he beheld a spiral of runes burned into the page, the sigla surrounded by the yellow discolorations of heat. "Ah," he whispered, "at last." He clutched the staff near him, golden face shining in the red heat of the fireplace. He began to read, when suddenly he saw before his eyes the figures of Shavas and Caramon, bodies twined together in passionate embrace. "I have no time for such things," he snarled, closing his eyes, banishing the vision. "Discipline." He prepared himself for the first glyph. Taking a deep breath, he aligned his mind with his goals, his will with his desires, and started down the winding path of power. A bolt of white sent his senses reeling in pain, and his nerves caught fire. Yellow shafts rained down on him, contorting his body into impossible forms. Orange beams seared his brain, a flood of cold that broke his essence. Red coils destroyed his thoughts, spiriting them away to the infinite. Blue spears cut into his flesh. "No, never!" Racing cried. Grabbing the black staff in both hands, standing alone in a universe of pain, he drew his will about him, gathering himself into a shining star of desire that kept his shattered form from falling to despair. The multicolored demons wailed around him, formless creatures from nether planes trying to ensnare his spirit and drag him into the abyss. Though he felt his essence falling deeper and deeper, he forced his eyes to gaze still at the cursed ruins. Racine knew that to give in, to cease reading for the slightest instant, would spell destruction for his being. Then he knew that he did not fight alone. Someone else had a stake in this battle for Racine's being. He laughed, daring and defying any world to take him, any plane to claim him for its own. The creatures ceased their tortures and fled. Exhausted, Racine fell across the book. Beneath him, he heard the text disappear with the hiss of a snake. The trap was defeated. He had escaped. Chapter 17. Shavas walked the path of crushed white stone that led back to her house, admiring her flowers, whose dew-heavy heads hung over the path. The morning sun glinted off the stained glass windows. Smiling, she tossed her head, shaking the masses of disheveled hair from her face. The estate was very quiet, and even the sound of the water clock was muffled, as if afraid to disturb her. Shavas went to the library, opening the heavy doors, closing them softly behind her. The room was empty. She frowned, wondering. What had she expected to find? The body of a young magic user, his soul torn from him, dragged to stand before the Dark Queen. Had he truly escaped, proving his power, or had he simply not tried? Shavas searched the room for some sign of his presence. There was none. The books on her shelf stood undisturbed. Perhaps he hadn't read them. Perhaps he hadn't even come. No, Shavas smiled and lifted the one book that the mage had not thought to replace. The one book that had seemed innocuous. He'd been here, and he had been triumphant. He was indeed worthy. Shavas carried the book upstairs to her room. Without disrobing, she lay down on her bed. Opening the heavy book, she settled into a comfortable position to read the pages that were no longer blank. On the spine of the text were 2 words, freshly inlaid with gold. Brothers Majere. A painting showed 2 men sitting around a campfire, one large, handsome warrior, the other thin and frail, dressed in red robes, holding a black staff with a gold dragon's claw, clutching a pale blue orb. Chavas began to read. Caramon enjoys guarding Racin's sleep. This is the only time that the mage seems to his brother to be at peace, though occasionally this peace too is shattered by disturbing dreams. Caramon has always guarded his weaker brother against the dangers of the world, whether cold, sickness, or more obvious threats. He feels personally responsible for Racin's well-being, though his brother does little to show his appreciation. The responsibility Caramon feels for his brother stems from their youth. Racin's physical weakness, his high intelligence, and naturally sly, cynical nature made him a target for bullies. Caramon's timely intervention prevented his frail brother's injury on several occasions when some of the pranks turned serious. Incapable of understanding the need to abuse the weak and helpless, Caramon became Racin's guardian. Racin himself developed a hatred of those who would harm the innocent, the weak. The brothers have championed several such causes in Krynn. Chavas sighed and bit her lip. Had she misjudged Raistlin? No, how could she? She had felt his ambition burning through his skin, and she had determined correctly that his lust for magic would overcome his lust for the pleasures of the flesh. The twins are inseparable, always together, yet always apart. Caramon has watched Racin grow more moody and introspective, even as the warrior himself becomes more outgoing. When Racin left to study magic, Caramon saw him change even more. Racin discovered that magic could compensate for his physical weakness. Through magic he can control, manipulate, dominate needs Caramon cannot understand, or rather has no need to understand. The fighter is popular, strong and handsome. He is admired and respected by his peers, most notably the friends of his youth, a rather motley collection of vagabond wanderers. See volumes Tanis Half-Elven, Flint Fireforge, Sternbride Blade, Kitiara Uthmatar, Tasselhoff Burfoot. Among them, Raistlin is tolerated. Racin possessed many qualities none of his peers can see. The most prominent is his courage, his willingness to fight those who would rule with an iron fist. This attribute is hidden beneath the young magician's unfriendly demeanor and cynical attitude. There have been many times when Racin, even as an apprentice mage, successfully unmasked the trickeries and glamours of the clerics of the so-called new gods, revealing them to be charlatans of the most parasitic kind, feeding on the fears of the populace. Racin believed none of them and turned their venomous trickeries upon themselves, showing the crowds of awestruck, fear-ridden people that these clerics were as false as their ideals. More than once, Caramon has been forced to pull his brother out of the way of ruined clerics bent on revenge. Caramon knows deep inside that he and his brother are slowly, inevitably drifting apart. Caramon sees that each day brings new power, insights, and magics to Raistlin. Though the mage's body can barely stand the strain. Caramon has watched his brother cast spells that turn the strongest warriors to ashes, only to see Raistlin collapse with convulsions that racked his body from inside, bringing blood to his lips. But each time Raistlin rises from his torment, struggling on arms too weak to lift himself, standing on legs limp with fatigue. And Caramon sees a very faint smile illuminate his brother's face. A smile that speaks of a great spirit unwilling to die, unwilling to let go of mortal flesh until every goal is ultimately achieved. It is because of this perseverance that Caramon knows he must admit ultimate defeat at the hands of his brother, though he rails against the thought. The vision of the towers of high sorcery, showing that Raistlin in his jealous rage was willing to kill even his twin, was the death knell of Caramon's fond dreams. "Ah," murmured Shavas, "now we're getting somewhere. More detailed information, please." The book obliged, adding a new page before the woman's eyes. No one knows for certain how Raistlin managed to pass the test, or the mysteries of the tower are hidden even to me. Certainly the young mage was nearly defeated in a contest with a dark elf known as Dalamar. It is thought that Raistlin traded his life's essence for his life. If that is true, then on some plane of existence there is a powerful being who watches over and protects the young mage, not out of kindness, perhaps, but to protect the being's own interests. Shavas closed the book for a moment, her fingers keeping her place. If that were true, it might hinder her plans, or it might help them, depending on the nature of the protector. She wished she'd known this information earlier. Now there was so little time. Shavas returned to her reading. At the end of the test, the masters arranged it so that it seemed to Raistlin that his twin Caramon was endowed with magic. In a jealous rage, thinking his brother had stolen the only thing in the mage's unhappy life that gave it any meaning, Raistlin killed Caramon. Actually, it was only a phantom of Caramon created by the masters. A Parthelian, head of the White Robes, had also arranged for Caramon to watch his own murder at the hands of his twin. When the brothers left the towers, their lives were forever changed. Raistlin has the power he seeks, but all Caramon has is time. Shavas tossed the book to the floor. Leaning back among the pillows, she began to laugh. That same morning, Lord Brunswick sat in his favorite chair in his estate's main living room, a spacious area covered with dark wood and filled with the accoutrements of wealth and power. The minister watched his children play with cold eyes, running his fingers along the length and width of a leather bag shaped like an oddly formed triangle. His youngest daughter ran over to him and grabbed the pouch. "What's that, Daddy?" The Lord slapped her across the face, pulling the bag away. "Don't touch that brat!" The girl wailed and ran to her mother. The Lord's wife, comforting the child, stared at her husband aghast. "Alfred, what's come to you?" The minister refused to answer, but stalked out of the room, slamming the double doors behind him. He heard the muffled voice of the woman consoling the child. There, tonight's the festivals of the eye. Think of the fun you'll have. The Lord grinned. Yes, tonight the fun would begin. The large house was dark. None of the rooms were occupied. The servants gone for the holiday. Brunswick walked through it hurriedly and into the grassy yard, clutching the bag to his chest. Tucking the pouch away under his belt, the Lord strode through the fields surrounding his home, coming upon one of the many streams that ran out of the city. He followed the tributary against the flow, walking steadily with purpose into Mereklar. Lord Brunswick came to a park with a small grove of trees standing in the middle, a monument to his family. He stood staring at it, then laughed in derision. A small mew answered his laugh. At the foot of the tree was a kitten, lost, looking perhaps for a mother who would never return. The Lord reached down and grabbed the kitten by the neck. Frantic with fright, the kitten clawed and scratched and sank its sharp milk teeth into the Lord's thumb. Swearing, the minister hurled the kitten from him. Brunswick concentrated on the pain. The blood dried and the wound closed and healed. Lord Brunswick's face darkened. He took the pouch from under his belt, tore open the flap, and pulled out a short wand, bent to an odd angle at one end. He pointed the wand at the kitten. An enraged snarl sounding from above his head caused the Lord to glance upward in fear. Too late. A huge black cat dropped from the tree, its weight driving the man to the ground. The wand flew from Brunswick's hand. The animal bared its long fangs, preparing to tear out the man's throat. The minister, with superhuman strength, threw the animal off his chest. Leaping to his feet, he crouched in a fighting stance. The huge feline slowly circled to the left, the Lord sidestepping in turn. Man and beast eyed each other warily, their bright, reflecting eyes shining. In a single motion, the minister shot forward, attempting to grab the cat by the neck, but the animal was too quick. It leaped aside and jumped on the man's back. The minister fought desperately, attempting to dislodge the panther by reaching up from behind. The cat worried the Lord in the back of the neck, using its hind claws to flay his flesh, tearing bleeding rents that should have killed the man in an instant. The minister fell heavily, his hand lighting on an object on the ground. There was a blazing flash of red light. The panther, stunned, toppled off the man. Lord Brunswick, reddish liquid pouring from his wounds, rose up and narrowed his eyes, concentrating his vision on the enemy before him. Another flash of red seared the skin from the panther's back. The cat made no sound. The pain shook it back to consciousness. It leaped again, straight at its enemy, but the minister had suddenly disappeared. The panther began to stalk the grove, casting its gaze about. It walked slowly, head sunk beneath its shoulders in fury. It made no sound until it whipped around, sinking its 4 claws into the arm of the minister as he reached out to aim for the wand. The man's mangled arm went limp, and the wand fell from his nerveless fingers. The lord, in desperation, attempted to grab the animal by the neck with his remaining good arm. The panther freed himself easily. Crouching on its hind legs, gathering strength, it sprang for the man's throat, white teeth flashing. A scream, a ripping sound, and a blood-drenched necklace rolled on the grass, a silver cat's skull with ruby eyes. Chapter 18. Have you ever heard of Dizzy Longtongue? The kender who could throw his hopak with such skill and accuracy that he could make it return to his hand? Well, one day a minotaur made a bet with Dizzy that he couldn't throw his staff around the girth of a forest, and Dizzy said, "I'll bet you the gold in my pocket against a ring in your nose that I can make my hopak come back to me from around the forest." The minotaur accepted and said that if he didn't make it, he would have Dizzy for dessert. Dizzy naturally agreed. Earwig paused to hear if any of his fellow prisoners had any comments such as, "Wow, isn't that interesting?" or "I can hardly wait to hear what happens." There was, however, only silence. Sighing, Earwig pressed on. "Dizzy took 100-pace running start before he let go of his hopak with a mighty zing. Dizzy and the minotaur waited for hours, listening for the sound of the returning hopak. After a day, the minotaur said, "Well, my lad, it looks like I'm having you for afters." And Dizzy said. A stabbing pain behind his eyes caused Earwig to lose his place in the story of Dizzy Longtongue. It was certainly an interesting sensation. His temples throbbed so that he thought his head would crack. But after consideration, the kender decided it was one sensation he could do without. Earwig tried to raise his hands to massage his eyes, but he couldn't move them that far, due to the chains on his wrists. That, too, was another interesting development. "I'm a prisoner in some black, damp cell, probably hundreds of feet below the ground, guarded by thousands of warriors who are armed to the teeth. A situation I've wanted to try." He enjoyed himself immensely for about an hour, but after that... "You know," said Earwig to his cellmates, whom he could see only dimly. One of them appeared to be quite bald. "This is nearly as much fun as I'd expected." In point of fact, despite the pain in his head and the chains on his wrists, Earwig was getting bored. And as anyone on Krynn knows, a bored kender is a most dangerous thing. "Boy, you guys are sure quiet," Earwig said, peering into the darkness. All he heard in answer was the steady, melodic drip of water, and even it quieted for a moment, as if wondering what the cell's latest inhabitant had to say. It soon grew loud again, uninterested in the conversation. Earwig sighed, thrashing in his chains. He had examined the lock as best he could, but it was just too dark to see. I couldn't open it anyway. My tools are missing." The kender, thinking of this, became highly indignant. "That's really not fair. I'll just mention that on my way out." The chains themselves were heavy and thick, and he doubted if even his mighty friend Caramon could break them in one try. The floor he sat on was cold and wet. The damp was making him sneeze. The walls were constructed from solid rock that nothing, seemingly, would penetrate. He thought of his Uncle Trap Springer, who had purportedly escaped from a prison cell by digging his way out with a spoon. That very spoon had become a sacred relic among Candor. I wonder what Uncle Trap Springer would do if he were down here, Earwig said out loud, half hoping he might get an answer. One never knew when or where Uncle Trap Springer might pop up. Apparently, however, it wasn't here. Earwig had no idea how long he'd been down wherever he was. He only knew he had to get out soon, or his mind would leave on its own. Why don't one of you guys tell me a story? Something I haven't heard before, the Candor prompted his silent cellmates. Well, how about it? No answer. Earwig frowned. He was beginning to lose all patience with the situation. He rummaged through his pockets for the 10th time, hoping to find something that could either help him escape or provide interesting entertainment. Handkerchief and a bit of fluff. Empty, empty. My spinner and nothing else. Frustrated, he dragged his chained hand over and gave the spinner a flick with his finger. Something jabbed him in the arm, coming from his right sleeve. The dart! Earwig exclaimed, pulling back the inner flap that kept the missile hidden. Don't worry, you guys. I'll have us out in a minute, he called to his silent companions in the cell. It's really strange, you know, he continued, talking to alleviate his cellmates' impatience. But someone used a dart like this to try to kill Caramon, and now it's helping me escape. Earwig thrust the dart into the lock of the manacle around his wrist. He seemed to recall Raistlin saying that the dart was tipped with a deadly poison, but that didn't matter. Death was better than sitting here and doing nothing. Inserting the tip of the dart into the keyhole, he ran the metal along his finger as a guide, feeling the point come to the first tumbler. Jiggling the projectile, he bypassed the second and third tumblers, jimmied past the fourth, and felt a sharp point press against his skin. That's it. The last tumbler gave way to his gentle proddings. Something soft, dust perhaps, flaked off the dart onto his skin, but in his excitement Earwig didn't notice. He slipped the dart into a pocket, threw the chains from his body, and stood triumphantly. All right, you guys are next. For just one brief, fascinating moment, the Candor thought he might pass out from the sudden pain in his head. But the dizzy spell went away, and the pain in his head eased. Earwig began to stumble blindly about the room, holding his arms out in front of him. He came to a wall, his hand slapping against a moist stone. Don't worry, Baldy, I'm coming. He followed the wall until his foot clattered into a heap of chains on the floor. There you are, he said, bending down to feel the shackles. Why didn't you tell me you were here? His hand closed, not around flesh, but around bone, the bone of a man long dead. I guess that's why you weren't much interested in Dizzy, said Earwig, feeling comforted. He'd really begun to think he was losing his talent as a storyteller. "Well, Baldy, if you'll excuse me, I'll be leaving now. I don't mean to be rude, but you're not very good company." Earwig moved blindly around the cell for a few moments more when he kicked an object, large and soft, lying on the ground near a wall. Kneeling down, he closed his hands around a long piece of wood with which he was very familiar. "My hoopak!" he cried. Reaching out with his other hand, he found his pouches. Rummaging through his gear, he discovered that everything he could remember having was still there, including the tinder box and a small torch. Soon bright yellow flame lit the room. Earwig gazed around the cell. There were 4 more skeletons chained to the walls in addition to the one he'd found. It looked as if they'd been there a while. But what really caught his attention were the walls themselves. They were covered with paintings and decorations, gold against black. "More stories," sighed Earwig, enraptured. He began to study them. "A long time ago," he said, tracing the pattern with his finger, "the world was whole, and everything was fine. Then something happened, and there were wars. Then nothing happened, and everyone thought they were happy, but they weren't really. Then came the cataclysm." He surmised, seeing what could only be pictures of a great mountain of fire falling from the sky. "Then what? We go back, and a guy in a red robe builds a great city of white stone? No, that doesn't seem right. Let's see. A guy in a black robe tricks the guy in the red robe into building the city of white stone. And then the guy in the red robes builds the city, and a guy in the white robes helps from behind." Earwig stood back, scratching his head in confusion. The first part of the story had been easy to follow, flowing in a vertical direction down the wall, but now everything he looked at branched out in hundreds of directions, over the ceiling, across the floor, along the walls, lines of gold connecting each to a large triangle. Following the lines, he came to a great stylized eye done in colors of red and white and black, staring at him in the wall opposite the triangle. All the gold lines in the room met at this symbol. Not much of a story," Earwig sniffed. "The plot goes absolutely nowhere." The Cantor put his pack on his back, adjusting it for comfort, shifting his shoulders against the weight. He started to walk out of the room when he realized that something essential to his plan of escape was missing. "A door! There's no door! How am I supposed to get out of here?" he demanded angrily. "Wait, maybe they hid the door, just so I'd have to find it." Cheering up, Earwig started to tap his hoopak against the walls, the wooden staff making a loud sound in the quiet of the cell. He systematically worked around from one corner to the others. Tack, 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 tick. That's it. He pushed with all his strength against a block, but couldn't move it. Maybe this isn't it, he concluded, leaning back against the wall to rest. Oh! The stone swung on hidden hinges, dumping the startled but highly elated Cantor onto the floor on the other side. "Wake up, Caramon." Thin fingers bit into the young man's shoulders. He was up and moving in an instant. With the instinct of a warrior, his body was functioning before his brain. "I'm here, I'm ready," he shouted, hands fumbling for his weapons. "Don't be alarmed yet. Get dressed." Caramon stared around sleepily and realized he was in his comfortable room in Barnstoke Hall rather than in a war camp that had come under attack from hordes of goblins. "Oh, sure, raced." He'd only been asleep, he judged, for several hours. "Just give me a couple of minutes to wash up and shave and—" Rayson brought the metal-shod end of his staff to the floor with enough force to shake the lamps on the walls. Caramon, startled, stared at his twin. Pain and outrage lined the golden face, flickering in the narrowed eyes. The warrior put his gear on quickly, as if he were about to engage in battle. Rayson, saying nothing, led the way from their room to the street. He seemed to have become a spirit of retribution overnight. What had happened? Caramon wondered. The people they met walking on the avenue shied away, crossing over to the other sidewalk to avoid meeting the mage. The brothers entered a carriage. Rayson commanded, "Westgate Street." The driver nodded confirmation, snapping the reins. The coach moved from along South Wall Street at a steady pace. Question burned Caramon's tongue, but he kept quiet. Rayson had not looked at him directly since he'd wakened him. The mage stared intently into the shops along the roads, pointedly ignoring his twin. Caramon, remembering with a rush of blood how he had spent the night, thought he knew the reason for his brother's ill humor. "Why is he blaming me?" the warrior demanded silently, feeling guilty and not liking it. He made his choice. He got what he wanted, and so did I. The coach turned right onto Westgate Street, and Caramon saw his brother tense, both hands gripping the black staff until the skin over the knuckles turned white. The fighter could see nothing, could sense no element of danger, but he drew his dagger. Rayson saw his action and snorted in derision. "Put your knife away, Caramon. You are in no danger." "Are you in danger?" the warrior asked. Rayson glanced at his brother. Pain twisted the golden face, then the mage looked swiftly away. His hands gripped the staff of mages with such intensity that his fingers seemed likely to crack and bleed. "Stop!" Rayson commanded the driver. The carriage rolled to a halt. The mage jumped out and began walking at a rapid pace down Westgate Street. Caramon followed his brother's quick footsteps as best he could. "Where are we going?" he asked. "To get a cup of java," Rayson replied without turning. Caramon stared at him in amazement. He was about to risk drawing down his brother's wrath by asking another stupid question when he saw a sight that stole the words from his mouth. The street was suddenly infested with a huge wave of cats, and in the middle of the tide, in front of a tavern, sat a single figure, a black-skinned man dressed in black. "Raced! That's the man who—" "Caramon, shut up," said his twin. At the brothers' approach, the cats scattered, running up and over the walls and down the street. Rayson came to stand in front of the man. Caramon joined his brother, the warrior's hand on the hilt of his sword. "Please join me," the man in black said. His voice had a faint hissing quality to it that made Caramon shiver. He glanced at Raistlin, who nodded. The fighter pulled a chair out and sat. The mage did likewise. Caramon stared at the man. He was incredibly handsome, and with dark black hair that curled down the back of his neck. His eyes were blue, a startling contrast to his shining black skin. And they were slightly slanted. He stared at them intently without blinking. "My name is Bast," he said suddenly. Jewels sewn onto his black clothing in a band around his neck glowed softly in the sunlight. "May I offer you a drink?" Without waiting for a reply, Bast lifted his hand, motioning for a barmaid. "Please, Catherine, 2 cups of Java for my guests." Catherine stared a moment, then spun on her heel and ran back into the restaurant. She came back almost immediately with 2 small cups. "Thank you," Caramon said. The girl mumbled something and backed away, but lingered near, watching. Raistlin sat as still and motionless as the city, his mouth set in a grim, dark lines. "Yes, questions," the man in black said, staring at the mage with intense blue eyes. "Who are you?" Raistlin asked. "You know who I am." "Why have you been following us?" "You know why." Raistlin flushed, growing angered. The man in black appeared amused. Caramon took a large gulp of his drink and burned the roof of his mouth. Apparently his brother had finally met his match. "Then what is your part in all this?" Raistlin demanded. "Why are you here?" "You know why," answered Bast, sharp white teeth flashing in a slow smile. Caramon cringed, waiting for the outburst. His brother seemed to literally swell with suppressed rage and frustration. The man in black watched him calmly, and the anger seeped from Raistlin like blood from a wound. How do I know what to believe?" "Believe what you want. It makes little difference to me." "No, I don't believe that," Raistlin said softly. "If so, why are you here meeting with me?" "I came here not to prove myself to you, but to prove you to myself." The man in black, who called himself Bast, rose slowly and lazily to his feet, stretching luxuriously, muscles rippling in his slender arms. He gave them a graceful nod of his head and moved off down the street. "Do you want me to stop him?" Caramon half rose. "No," said his brother sharply, gripping the warrior's wrist. "He's a foe beyond your strength, beyond your comprehension. You would be dead within moments." Caramon sat back down, somewhat relieved. He felt the truth of his brother's statement, though he couldn't quite say why. The big warrior only knew that for one of the few times in his life he'd actually been afraid. Raistlin was regarding his brother coldly, his eyes narrowing to thin lines. "One night with a woman makes you very bold this morning, brother. She must have been something special." "I don't want to talk about it," said Caramon quietly. "Why not? You've never minded flaunting your conquest before.
Maybe I did, because that's... But that's because I can still have those kinds of feelings. I can know what it is to love someone.
Caramon tossed his barbed words without aim, goaded into fighting by his brother's bitter sarcasm. But when he saw them hit their target, he would have given his soul to take them back. Raison's shoulders jerked, as if pierced to the heart. The thin frame seemed to collapse in on itself. His head bent, his body trembled. He gathered his robes around him.
I'm sorry, Raist,
Caramon began. No, Caramon. His twin raised a feeble hand. I am the one who should apologize. Your comments were most perceptive.
What happened to you last night?
Asked Caramon with the intuitive knowledge of a twin. The mage said nothing for a minute. He stared down into his Java, watching the brew swirl in the cup. I was nearly destroyed last night.
An ambush?
Caramon started to stand again.
It was that man, wasn't it? That bast fellow, all...
No, my brother. It was a trap. A magical trap. It was set for me in one of the books.
Trap? Where? In Lady Chavas's house?
Caramon stared incredulous. Yes, in Lady Chavas's house.
You think she set it, don't you?
Caramon demanded, growing angry. I found 3 books of magic in her library, my brother, and one of them contained a rune spiral that nearly captured my soul and dragged me into the abyss. What would you think?
It was an accident. She couldn't know that she had something like that in her house.
How could she not know? Ah, I remember now. There are no magicians in Mereklar. The mage mimicked the woman's voice. A perfect excuse.
You don't suspect? You do think she did it on purpose?
His twin's silence spurred Caramon further.
Why would she want to do that?
He yelled.
She's the one who hired us. She defended us to the ministers.
Exactly. Why would she want me? Raisin paused, eyes narrowing.
Look, Raist,
said Caramon, breathing heavily, trying to control his anger.
You're smarter than I am, I admit that. You seem to know a lot more about what's going on here than I do. Someone tried to kill both of us in the woods. Then someone tried to kill me. Someone's tried to trap you. Earwigs disappeared. Now you come here on purpose to meet that man who's been following us. How did you know he'd be here? How did he? I think you should tell me what's going on.
Raistlin shook his head. So much to do, and so little time. Tonight, Caramon, the great eye shines tonight, and I am not ready. He sighed, then said, If you must know, in one of the books I saw a picture of that man standing in a place that looked familiar to me. I realized this morning that the place was here, Westgate Street.
You saw him in a book? What did it say about him?
That he was a creature of great evil. But after meeting him, I'm no longer sure what to believe.
I know.
Caramon shuddered.
He'd just as soon rip out your heart as look at you.
Perhaps, but... "Excuse me, gentlemen." It was the barmaid. Caramon vaguely remembered that her name was Catherine. "I couldn't help overhear you mention Earwig. Do you mean Earwig Lockpicker, the cantor?" "You've seen Earwig? Where is he?" Rayson asked with interest. "I don't know. That's what I've come to tell you. I think he's been abducted.